The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly On Poly podcast. One hand says one thing, one hand says the other thing. So anyway, where does the continuing freeze for 3 years get us?
Well, I will say just on this point, I mean, it's not unusual for a cabinet minister to, once the decision has been made, to almost refuse to talk about what happened behind cabinet doors.
Then, later on The Agenda.
Popularity is meaningless unless you use it to do big and good things for your country and for the people of Canada. Then it's meaningless. Who cares?
You know what I like about doing this on television now?
What's that?
Besides working with you, I walk into the clothes closet, I blow past all the suits and ties, and look what they're letting us wear now. Isn't this great?
Yeah, I mean, you have a great Ontario icon. I went with more like a Star Wars iconography.
Do you want to take us through that? I just noticed that. You got what?
So there are X-Wings and TIE fighters, the Millennium Falcon. These are all very meaningful spaceships from the Star Wars universe.
You are a very strange person.
Well, you know, I thought it was like nerdy, but also discreet and tasteful.
Well, I'll give you that. How do you like my province of Ontario?
Well, I mean, you are actually repping the provincial public broadcaster.
There you go.
There you go.
Shall we get down to business?
Let's do it.
Issue 1, here we go. The provincial government has announced it will spend nearly $1.3 billion on the province's colleges and universities. With so many foreign students now not coming to Ontario due to the federal cap, the lack of enrollment could cost the sector $1.8 billion. Add to that a tuition freeze that's been in place since 2019, and that will continue for another 3 years. And colleges and universities say they are really feeling the pinch big time. Okay, JMM, take us through where the money's going.
The funding from the province is going to, in part, top up post-secondary institutions, colleges and universities who, as we say, are worried about that tuition money evaporating. But it's also going to provide grants for northern schools in particular, money for STEM programs, as well as mental health services.
Now, the provincial government has been touting that this is an historic investment in the post-secondary sector, but they also appointed a blue ribbon panel several months ago to give them some advice on what to do. And how does the amount of money the sector is getting compare to what the blue ribbon panel has recommended that they get?
Well, I mean, not for the first time with this government. They have solicited advice from a panel of experts and then not hugely followed through with that advice. The Blue Ribbon panel recommended a bailout, so to speak, of about $2.5 billion. So the government is ponying up a little over half of what this panel of experts had said was needed. The Council of Ontario Universities says that there are 10 institutions across the province that are looking at running deficits this year. So a bit of a funding crisis, so to speak, in the post-secondary sector.
We are happy to give credit where it's due, and our friends at Global News reported this week that the Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, was apparently prepared to raise tuition by 5% over 3 years, but the Premier intervened and stopped her from doing it. He insisted they be frozen. She has subsequently told CBC News that she, in fact, was never in favor of increasing tuition. One hand says one thing, one hand says the other thing. So anyway, where does the continuing freeze for 3 years get us?
Well, I will say just on this point, I mean, it's not unusual for a cabinet minister to, once the decision has been made, to almost refuse to talk about what happened behind cabinet doors with those kinds of debates, right? Yeah. You have to back the government plan once the decision has been made, and in this case, once the Premier has made that decision. So this Premier obviously really emphasizing affordability in terms of the post-secondary sector, right? They froze tuition more or less at the beginning of their time in government. Don't particularly want to revisit that in a way that would make it much more expensive for students and, let's be honest, some parents to fund those classes. But, you know, this tuition freeze does continue to pose real problems for the post-secondary sector. So, you know, I think it's fair to say at this point, if all of government is a balancing act, the Premier is still preferring to balance in favor of students and families who are worried about paying these tuition bills, not so much worried about the post-secondary sector right now.
Every time he has a press conference, affordability, affordability, affordability. That's become his brand. Now, how do I put this? I don't normally spend a lot of time in our segments here telling people who we don't have coming up on the program. We like to sort of promote who we do have coming up on the program. But next Monday, the staff of the Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, said that she would appear on the agenda Monday night to talk about this announcement. But then, after confirming that she would appear, they called me back to say the interview was off. Now, we are still going to cover the subject on Monday's edition of the agenda because we want to go do a little deeper dive on this. Alas, the minister will not be with us. There is no word on why she was pulled from the show. Can we offer some informed speculation here?
Well, the press conference that Minister Dunlop held earlier in this week to announce this aid package for universities, let's just say it did not go well. It was widely panned, I think. As is not terribly uncommon in, I would say, politics broadly, but with this government in particular, the minister really just ignored a lot of the questions, just gave boilerplate answers, really stuck to the message track. Multiple occasions, you have reporters saying that's not an answer. You're not answering the question I asked.
They don't usually do that.
Sorry.
Reporters don't usually come in and say, that's not an answer to the question.
You really have to
try not to be obnoxious, but in this case, there really were no answers to legitimate questions.
Yeah, you really have to try to get us to be that assertive. Let me put it that way. Didn't seem to get her off the message track at all. It's possible that Dunlop's performance did not give people confidence that she would handle herself well in other TV interviews, like, for example, on the agenda.
And you know what? I would have gone the exact opposite way. I would have said I can understand why she might have had a tough time with a pack of hyenas yelling questions at her during a press conference, but we offer a civilized environment in which to have reasonable discussions in this studio. And, what can I say? I'm disappointed that she got pulled, but I think we can infer why that happened.
And no offense to our other colleagues in the Queen's Park Press Gallery when we say that we can sometimes come off as hyenas. That's meant only with love.
Of course. They're paid to be hyenas, or at least, yes. Ask some tough and aggressive questions. Anyway, I know later on we're going to talk about your column, my column. I'm going to talk about something else. The youngest cabinet minister of all time who was appointed 50 years ago this week. But I also, just because I did not enjoy that news conference so much, I did another column this week on this, and that's up on our website as well, tvo.org/the agenda. Scroll down, click on my face. That column is there. Okay, on to issue 2. Premier Doug Ford has raised the hackles of some who work in Ontario's justice system by saying out loud, twice or maybe 3 times this week actually, that he wants judges appointed who share his conservative philosophy, like-minded. No Liberals, no New Democrats need apply. JMN, this story has had a lot of legs this past week. Why do you think it's caused such a fuss?
I think, at least in Canada, the justice system is an area where I think there's broad agreement that you don't actually want to politicize appointments overtly. Courts are too important and their decisions need to be respected, even when you disagree with them. You don't want to go down the road of, not to engage in some knee-jerk anti-Americanism here, but I think most Canadians broadly appreciate that our judicial system is not overtly partisan the way so much of the American judiciary is.
I would agree. And there's this joke in politics. They say a gaffe in politics is when you say out loud something that is true. Yes. And, it may very well be that Doug Ford has simply articulated out loud twice, 3 times, 4 times this week, something which all parties do, but which he has simply said out loud. Do we think that's true? Well,
there has been some reporting from, in particular, the Globe and Mail on how at the federal level you've got judicial appointments that, let's say, they are closely correlated with campaign donations to the Liberal Party of Canada, just as a for example. So, on the one hand, I think we can say that Premier Ford is getting panned here for something that other governments do, and but more quietly and maybe a bit more discreetly. There is a separate issue that it's not just about appointing people who share the government's philosophy, but there's also the question of the quality of appointments, if I can put it that way. Remember that we're not talking about Doug Ford directly appointing judges. We're talking about appointees to a committee that itself nominates appointments for provincial judges. And, some of these appointees, I think there's fair reasons to question their qualifications, right? The Liberal Party earlier this week sent out a press release noting that one of Ford's appointees is not just a registered lobbyist, which, do we want to mix lobbying and the do we want to mix lobbying and the judiciary? I think that's a very, very fair question. But in particular, this appointee is a lobbyist for an American gun manufacturer. So I think that's quite aside from the issue of does the Premier want like-minded judges, these appointees in particular, I think there's lots of fair grounds to criticize them.
And now on to issue 3. Back in November last year, Mike Schreiner introduced Bill 156. It's the Homes You Can Afford in the Communities You Love Act. These names are getting more and more intriguing, aren't they?
Indeed.
You were excited to bring this bill to our attention on this podcast today. How come?
Well, if you just started watching this podcast when we were put in prime time, you may not know that I'm a giant nerd for planning policy.
I think we know.
Poor Steve has suffered through my obsession for years now. So this is a planning bill, and Schreiner's bill would do a bunch of things. It would make changes to the Planning Act that would legalize fourplexes and four-story buildings across Ontario and legalize mid-rise buildings. These are like buildings of roughly, let's say, 4 to 10 stories, particularly on transit corridors, again, across Ontario. It would help speed up approvals, bypass the Ontario Land Tribunal, and it would match a lot of policies that we are already seeing happen at the local level to varying degrees, like, for example, in Schreiner's hometown of Guelph. But it would apply them province-wide.
Now, the bill apparently has been punted over to a committee instead of being debated for second reading, which I'm sure will be a bit of a disappointment to the leader of the Green Party of Ontario.
Yes, he was quite vocal about this disappointment. It's a bit of an odd step. Normally, you have the second reading debate, and then there's a vote, and then it goes to a committee. So this was an unusual step, and Schreiner had some things to say about that.
Let's have a look.
Yeah, I was surprised. I was literally sitting on the floor of the House, and I heard a government member move a motion to discharge Bill 156 to committee. And if you probably go back and listen to the recording, there's this person going, "What bill number?" and then somebody said 156, and I'm like, "That's my bill." So I was completely shocked, frankly, because I thought this was a bill that every party would support.
Now, the government, of course, is in control of the agenda of the House. They do have a majority government. Why would they do this for a bill that seems to have so much widespread support?
So when I'm going to go back in time a little bit here, when the Liberals were in power, one of the time-honored tactics of opposition parties is you bring a bill forward that is good and sensible enough that the government can't really oppose it, but they for whatever reason they don't want to be seen to totally kill it, and so the government of the day, and under the Liberals, it was very common. They would let the bill pass, they would let it get sent to committee, and then it would never be heard from again. And so that might be something that is happening here, right? The government simply is punting it to the committee where we will never hear from it again. Except that the government has its own housing bill that Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Paul Calandra, has said that he will be bringing a bill forward in coming weeks. And it could be, maybe a bit more optimistically, a bit more charitably, it could be that the government is going to study both its own bill and Schreiner's bill through the committee process, and they could say, actually, we really like Schreiner's idea, and we're just going to fold it into the government legislation. That's the kind of thing that they could do. Schreiner has said, he's all for the government taking his ideas.
That happens all the time, frankly. Opposition members will put forward bills. The government likes some of the ideas, but they don't want to give the opposition credit, so they'll literally steal the idea, put it in their own bill. It's a new number. It's a new title for the bill. They'll pass it, and they'll take all the credit for it as if it was their own. They may be doing that in this case here with the housing bill. maybe they might be doing it on another bill as it relates to the 407. You got anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that another idea that Schreiner has been a huge proponent of, that I'm let's say less optimistic about. He has been a very strong proponent of having the government pay for the tolls for freight trucks to use the 407. You would take a bunch of trucking off of the 401 and help sort of decongest that part of the provincial highway system and shift some of that traffic to the 407. It's the kind of thing that could be implemented quickly, but the reason why I suspect it's probably not going to happen under this government is because Schreiner, of course, wants us to do that as a alternative to building Highway 413. The Ford government is not looking for any alternatives to building the 413.
That is not on. That is not on. But would the idea be that you take trucks off the 401, let them use the 407, but not pay tolls?
Yeah. So the government would pay their tolls for them. It would be expensive. It would be billions of dollars over years because the 407 costs money. But in terms of it's something that could be done relatively quickly. Like you just really need to cut the check. You don't need to build any new infrastructure. It's something that like people would notice reasonably quickly. Like, even driving through, I don't own a car, but when I do drive on the 401, it's like, yeah, like the trucking is like everywhere. And this is a problem that is getting more acute as people rely more and more on things like e-commerce, right? There's just more and more trucks on the road.
And the 407 is underutilized. So at some level, it makes sense to try to get vehicles off the 401, put them on the 407, presumably better for both highways.
Yeah, exactly. And you could equalize the traffic a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see if they steal that idea going forward. On to your column, my column. Okay, it's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, this past week. JMM, what caught your fancy this past week?
The environmental NGO, Environmental Defense, put out a report arguing for a really big increase in government funding for transit operations. Broadly speaking, we've got two buckets of transit funding. You have capital spending, which is like the cost of actually building stuff, digging out a subway tunnel, building new LRT lines, whatever. And then there's the decidedly unsexy operations side, which is like actually funding the service. So the bus shows up on time, so the trains show up on time, that kind of thing. A very old problem in lots of places, but we're talking about Ontario, is that governments love to show up for the capital spending side of things. They love to show up for the ribbon cutting. But then when it comes time to actually fund the bus operations, the LRT, whatever, they are nowhere to be found. So this new report from Environmental Defense argues that just by getting some of the buses we already own that are currently idled because we are not spending the money to run them, we could substantially improve transit service. And then over a period of many years, we could really build out a very robust transit system across Canada's cities. They take a nationwide lens, but they do have estimates for Ontario and how much it would cost here. But basically, the upshot is that if you did that and you also, we're going to get back to planning, if you liberalized planning rules so that you could build more homes and around transit, that you could get really massive greenhouse gas emissions reductions on par or, in fact, exceeding what we would get from electric vehicle adoption.
Gotcha. My column for this past week, how do I put this? It emanates from the swearing in of the current cabinet of Ontario, which was back in 2022 after Doug Ford won that election. And Michael Ford, his nephew, was appointed to the cabinet. I think he was 28 years old. And a lot of people in the press gallery came up to me because they figured I'd know. And they say, was Michael Ford, is he the youngest cabinet minister in Ontario history ever appointed? And I think I was able to say, no, he was not. There was somebody younger. And we looked back into the books and we figured out who it was. And that's who I wrote about this week. Because I want everybody to know who the youngest cabinet minister in Ontario history ever was. His name was Dennis Timbrell. He was the member of the legislature for Don Mills. He was 24. Can you imagine? He was 24 when he was elected in 1971 for the first time, and then 27 when Bill Davis put him into cabinet. Guess what portfolio he got when he got put into cabinet?
seniors in long-term care.
Quite the opposite, actually.
Okay.
He got the Minister of Youth, of course. Minister of Youth. Bill Davis was really quite impressed with Dennis Timbrell. He didn't stay in the youth portfolio for very long, promoted him to Minister of Energy, where he did quite a good job there. Actually helped save the minority government on a couple of occasions by finding compromises that saved the day. Then he got moved into health. He was the longest-serving health minister of the last 50 years and fourth all-time. Health ministry is about 100 years old. When Mr. Davis retired, Dennis Timbrell ran for the leadership convention to replace him. And this is another reason why I wanted to write this column. I've covered a lot of leadership conventions, like probably 25 over the years. This was the dirtiest trick I have ever seen to prevent a candidate from winning. It was perpetrated by the winning side, Frank Miller's team, against Dennis Timbrell. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because I want you to go to the website and read the column. Suffice to say, it was a uniquely dirty trick with all sorts of very unfortunate racist overtones as well. But it worked, and Frank Miller won, and Dennis Timbrell lost. And all these years later, this was in 1985, so we're talking almost 40 years later, it still bugs Dennis Timbrell when we talk about this. So anyway, Mr. Timbrell's now 77 years old. He lives in St. Thomas, Ontario. He's got 7 kids, 16 grandkids, 10 great-grandkids, and another due in June. So his life, I think it's fair to say, is both amazing and incredibly hectic. So there we go.
All right, let's head to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we are always happy to hear it. Our email address is onpolitics@tvo.org. Go ahead, stick your hand in the mailbag and pull out something for this week.
We should get like a prop mailbag.
We should, right, we should.
So we're going to start up with a follow-up email to our segment last week on the song A Place to Stand. Allison Little from Toronto writes, "Hello, JMM, Steve, and the On Poly team. A long time, first time. In 2017, I worked at the Archives of Ontario and helped build their sesquicentennial exhibit to mark the 150th anniversary of Confederation." Sidebar here, I just love the word sesquicentennial.
It's a nice word, yeah.
It included a small section on the centennial anniversary in 1967, given the amount of material from that time in the archive's collections and interest from our core audiences. That section included a TV looping the film A Place to Stand. Part of my job included figuring out who held the rights to the song so that we would be in the clear to use it in the exhibit. Turns out that the province owns the rights to the Oscar-winning IMAX film A Place to Stand, but an American music publisher now owns the rights to the song.
Aha.
As long as we screened the film, all good. Using just the song would have required a worldwide streaming license.
How about that? Okay, Allison, thank you for that clarification because we did talk about this song last week. And I think we did something else last week. You want to know something funny? I played hockey this morning, and one of my hockey buddies came in to the dressing room and said, "Hey, I saw you singing on your show last week. So did you want me to sing a couple of more verses of A Place to Stand while we're here?"
I'm good. I don't, I'm not clamoring for it, but you know what? Like the audience might get back to us on that.
I think the verdict is in, and probably people have heard enough. Okay, here's a question from a listener named Sean Thompson, who is from the great city of Hamilton, Ontario, who writes, "To the On Poly team, I have a deep care and concern for our heritage laws in Ontario. With the recent emphasis on fast-tracking housing, I have great concerns that our Prime Minister or some office will try to remove or circumvent the processes and protections we have in place to ensure the Native and Euro-Canadian history of Canada is respected. Can our provincial leaders sweep away or ignore our heritage laws to speed up development? Has it happened before? Keep up the great work and cheers, Sean Thompson." Okay, Sean, thank you for that. JMM, got an answer for him.
Well, I guess the short version to the question is the Ontario Heritage Act and similar laws are just provincial laws. They don't emanate from the Constitution particularly, so except I guess insofar as there's laws concerning like archaeological respect for Indigenous burials, that kind of thing. But if the government wants to repeal these laws in their entirety, they can do so. They have not done that. but let's give a bit of context here. We're talking about the Ontario Heritage Act in particular that was brought in 1975 under Bill Davis. We are speaking to you from the Bill Davis studio.
We are.
The Ontario Heritage Act allows properties to either be listed or designated as heritage structures by citizens petitioning their municipal councils. Listed properties generally have less protection than designated ones. A designated property, you really require the municipal consent to make any kind of substantial structural changes to a building, and certainly to demolish it. Listed properties generally have fewer protections, but there is a time limit. You have to a 60-day waiting period before you can demolish a listed property.
Now, Mr. Davis's government would have brought these changes in the mid-1970s, so we're talking 50 years ago, pretty much.
Yes.
Presumably, there have been some changes to the legislation since then.
Yeah, various governments have amended the act. As you can imagine, you get one government that is more in favor of heritage protection, so they strengthen the law. And then you have, for example, the current government, which has made changes to the law that I think are broadly viewed as allowing more redevelopment and have put I would say heritage advocates would say it has put more heritage properties at risk. We've talked a lot on this podcast about Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, another one of those legislative titles. The distinction here, we're going to go back to this issue of listed versus designated properties, right? Municipalities have created huge lists of heritage listed properties, and the government believes, I think it's fair to say, that this part of the law is being overused and is being overused specifically to hinder redevelopment in Ontario's cities. So they implemented a change to the law, basically saying that you either have to go through the work of taking a listed property and designating it, or by, I believe it's January 1st, 2025, all of those listed properties are being delisted, and then they cannot be relisted for another 5 years. And so the government is basically try to sweep them all aside and say, either get serious about it and designate those properties, or just your lists are going away.
Sorry, which government is doing that?
This is the Ford government.
Ford government,
Yes,
the provincial
Ontario
government
provincial government.
Okay.
So just to give an example, a real-world example here, the city of Ottawa has 4,600 listed heritage buildings. Cities are relentlessly clever at finding ways of, let's say, tweaking provincial policy directives. So the city of Ottawa, in order to get around this provincial directive, is delisting all of its heritage properties and then relisting them. And that's going to buy them another 2 years of time on the clock. That said, it's not exactly the Wild West here. If you are a developer and you destroy a heritage building, there can still be pretty substantial consequences, fines of up to $1 million and potentially even jail time.
Now, that doesn't happen.
No.
And in fact, as you're saying this, I'm remembering an example right now from the middle 1980s. I remember Art Eggleton was the mayor of Toronto, and there was in the west end of Toronto, there was an old CN train station, and it was a really historic site, and I think it had been designated, as you have suggested here. But CN wanted to do something else with that site. They wanted to tear down the train station and be able to put up, some kind of new development. And the city wasn't letting them do it. So you know what CN did?
They just knocked it down.
They just did it anyway. They knocked it down anyway. Nobody got fined. I shouldn't say nobody got fined. Nobody went to jail. That's for darn sure.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the heritage site was no more.
Yeah. And I mean, with property values in Toronto being what they are, you can imagine there are plenty of places where paying the $1 million fine would just be the cost of doing business.
Insignificant in a development that might cost $150 million to put up.
And then, there is also some edge cases where there was an example at Bloor and Young just a few years ago where the developer knew that the city council was going to try and get the property listed at its next meeting or something, and they knocked it down overnight.
Ugh.
So,
all right, I think we got time for one more. Let's do one more listener email. This is from Sean Moore from Ottawa, who writes specifically to you. This is apropos of the question we got last week on the difference between a village, a hamlet, a town, a township, a city, etc. So here goes Sean Moore. Did you know, he writes, that there was yet another category in Ontario? A police village. Example, Byron, Ontario, since 1960, part of London, but it had a longer history on the banks of the Thames. When our family moved there in 1958, it was deemed the, quote, largest police village in Ontario. Admittedly, a minor distinction, right, Sean? That is... That's some deeply nerdy observation.
Oh,
there.
I love
right
it
up your
so
alley,
much.
I bet.
Yes, absolutely. So it's not going to shock you that I was in fact aware of police villages. I'm delighted to get emails like this. So police villages go back to, in fact, before Confederation, when Upper Canada was still figuring out local government, basically, and there was a lot of experimentation, I think you could say. So the idea behind police villages was that you would get very small localities. We're talking about as few as 150 people could come together and they could fund local priorities, starting with, as the name implies, a police service, right? Remember that, like, this is rural, the smallest of small town Ontario, before Ontario was even a province. The OPP don't exist. Yeah. And you need some way for there to be law and order. And one solution was to have these police villages. And they continued into the 1950s and the 1960s before, and we're going to once again name check Bill Davis. One of the things Premier Davis did was a big reorganization of municipal government in 1971. And so police villages were all folded into various other regional municipalities. We mentioned, though, this topic came up because we were talking about the issue of, who gets to call themselves a town, a city, et cetera.
Oh, I recall. There are very, very strict rules around this. Oh, no, wait a second. There are no rules around this at all. No.
And I think I have found the perfect case to illustrate this. King City in York Region, right, is a municipality north of Toronto. It was founded first as a village, and then in, I believe, 1890, it became a police village. No, I'm sorry, I have this wrong. It was founded as a village in 1890, then it became a police village in the 1930s. It remained nominally a police village until 1971, when it was incorporated into York Region.
And you know what it is today? A nice place to visit.
Yes.
There you go. Well, as you say, there are no rules.
No rules.
And that's fine.
There's no law.
We do have one rule. We do have one law. We got to get off on time.
Yes.
That is the On Poly podcast for this March the 1st, 2024.
You can follow our shows on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And if you already follow our show, help a friend follow it too.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org, and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Brian Mulroney was one of those prime ministers who inspired great affection and loyalty, but also tremendous opposition and fury. Maybe that's because he wanted to do big things that he knew people would either love or hate. He was not satisfied being a transactional prime minister. He wanted to be a transformational one, and he was. Free trade, the goods and services tax, leading the fight against South Africa's apartheid system. 2 attempts at constitutional renewal. And to date, he's still the only Conservative Prime Minister since Sir John A. Macdonald to win back-to-back majority governments, as he did in 1984 and 88. Mr. Mulroney, of course, died yesterday at age 84. I had numerous interviews with him over the years. The first in 1983, when he successfully contested the Progressive Conservative Party leadership. Here's one now from 2011.
Mr. Mulroney, we're here at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. We've just finished watching your session on the Canadian-American relationship, and I want to read a quote from the March issue of Policy Options to get us started here, in which you said, "The most important file on my desk and on the desk of any Prime Minister of Canada is the Canada-U.S. relationship." So let's start there. Why is that number one?
Well, because they're our neighbors, our largest trading partner by far, friends, allies with whom we have border and security matters that govern our lives. And so there's that. Plus there is the fact that because we're cheek by jowl with the Americans, our influence internationally is often predicated on the extent to which foreign leaders perceive us as having influence in the Oval Office.
So if we're on better terms with them, the rest of the world notices.
They know it. They know it. You hear about it all the time. They phone you and ask you to intervene with the president because there are 200 leaders around the world, 200 countries, trying to get audiences with him, trying to talk to him, and most don't get through.
Have you got a for instance on that? Sometimes some foreign leader called you and said, look, I can't get through to Reagan or Bush, but maybe you could run some interference for us?
Sure. I remember a moment that the President Bush, just before the Gulf War, had given a press conference. And in the press conference, he said, after this, I will be on the phone with my friend Prime Minister Mulroney, and then we're going to do such and such and so and so. And it was early morning for some reason, the press conference before the war. And I was at 24 Sussex, and I watched it on TV. 5 minutes later, the switchboard, Prime Minister's switchboard, said, I have a call from President Abdou Diouf, who was the president of Senegal. And he said, I just heard on TV, on CNN, that President Bush said he would be calling you momentarily. I've been trying to get this item on the agenda for some time unsuccessfully. Could you raise with him such and such?
And did you?
Sure I did.
You did, okay.
Absolutely I did.
I was interested in your characterization that is job one, because I always thought the number one file on any Canadian Prime Minister's desk was keeping the country together.
Well, that's just an assumption. Of course, that's what you have to do.
But I inferred from this that this is actually bigger than that.
Well, no, no country, no, you don't need anything else.
Okay.
No, of course.
So
Inherent in your responsibilities is that, of course. I'm talking about the exercise of your power, as your authority as Prime Minister in terms of your relationships.
Gotcha. Okay, 20 years ago, you signed that historic acid rain agreement with the United States. You also, of course, did the free trade agreement. You also did the Arctic sovereignty agreement. These were big ideas, big projects.
And NAFTA.
And NAFTA came, of course, in 1993. Big ideas, big projects, and I wonder whether those days are gone. Some people think the idea, the era of the big idea, is gone now. What do you think?
Well, there's been a dearth of them in recent years, but that may be because of the nature of a minority parliament. And it's hard to get, if you have a majority, you can do things that are easier than the situation in which Mr. Harper found himself and finds himself, particularly with an uncooperative opposition.
When is the opposition ever cooperative?
Never.
Just wondered.
Certainly not in my experience.
I just wondered, yeah.
Certainly not in my experience. Although when Mr. Chrétien was there, the Reform Party always were voting with him on budgetary things because they said he wasn't going far enough.
Right.
I didn't have that experience. So, yeah, I think that there are big ideas out there. For example, the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement that they're presently negotiating. The border security issue, Canada-US, which is out there.
Does that rival what you were trying to do 20 years ago, do you think, in terms of a big project?
It's a big project, but because the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was foundational, it probably takes a little priority, but it still remains big ideas. No, there are great things that the country can do, and you know, I think we have an interesting time here in Canada. You've got Prime Minister Harper, who's clearly a competent Prime Minister. You've got Mr. Ignatieff, who has the worst job in Canada, by the way. I had that job as leader of the opposition. This is a tough, thankless job. And he's an intelligent man, hardworking guy. You never can tell what happens in political life. I'll tell you this. In 1984, when the campaign started, I was 14 points behind. And we ended up in a rather different fashion. So you never can tell what'll happen in that regard. You've got Mr. Layton, who's an outstanding leader of his party. And you've got Gilles, his father, by the way, was in my caucus, in my cabinet and caucus. The finest gentleman who ever sat in the House of Commons.
Robert Layton.
Was Robert Layton. And then you've got Gilles Duceppe, who, while he espouses a point of view certainly different from mine, he's respected in Quebec. So these are people of quality. And with that, after an election, after you get the stuff out of the system, however it turns out, you can do big things, even if you have a minority parliament. Witness what happened to Mr. Pearson, who achieved great things with minority status.
I was intrigued in your description downstairs of the importance of personal relationships in trying to move files forward. And of course, it's legendary. You had an excellent relationship with Ronald Reagan and with George Bush the father. And I wonder if you could go into that a little bit more. How does it enhance the notion of moving the big idea forward when you're on, when you're on a Ron and George Bryan first name basis with these other leaders?
Where it becomes important, indeed indispensable, is that only the President of the United States can energize his entire system. When the Prime Minister goes there, if he's privileged to have an excellent relationship with the President, and they're sitting around the cabinet table, for example, with Ronald Reagan, and Reagan would listen to everything, and there were like 7 cabinet secretaries and 5 advisors or whatever it was, and Reagan would listen, and then he would say, I want this to happen. I want this to happen with Canada. That was the end of the debate. Reagan thereby energized the entire system. And these people had everything riding on it, Reagan's success and their own careers.
Well, the question is, does he energize the system more energetically because he knows you, likes you, trusts you?
He wouldn't even do it if he didn't.
So that matters.
You wouldn't get to see him. There are all kinds of leaders around the world who never see the inside of the White House. So to be able to come and go as we did, and to be in constant telephone communication, putting forward Canada's agenda, but helping the United States every time we could.
It is a balancing act, though, isn't it? Because,
It is.
because being anti-American plays well at home.
Yeah.
How do you walk that balance?
Well, look, I ran in 2 elections as someone who was pro-American, and I won both of them. So the anti-Americanism is overblown, but it has a constituency. There's a left-wing constituency in the country that is really attracted to this kind of stuff, and they have supporters in the media, radio and television, and
Your favorites are the Toronto Star and the CBC.
well, in my time, I don't follow it much anymore, so I don't know what it's like now.
Every time I've interviewed you, you've said that. You say, I don't follow this stuff so much anymore, but you must. I mean, you're a junkie for this, aren't you?
No, I'm not. No,
Really? Not anymore?
No, I was, but I'm really not anymore.
Okay, having said all that, my hunch is, and I think I'm on solid ground with this, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama do not have as close a personal relationship as, say, you and Ronald Reagan did or you and George Bush did. Does that mean Canada and the United States will necessarily not be able to achieve great things given that lack of a strong rapport?
No, what I understand is that they have a good relationship.
But not great, not like you guys
Well,
had.
we had a good one. And I'm not there sitting in the Oval Office with them, so I can't judge. Maybe it's terrific. All I know is it's certainly good and very good. Now, one of the problems is the tremendous demands on the president's time. So to get heard, to get understood, to get energized, to mobilize the administration, to set Canada up there as a priority, believe me, you've got to get up early in the morning and you've got to press your case and your advantage all the time. And that's what has to be done. And we'll see after the election how this moves along.
Sure. Since we're in the realm of personal relationships here and their significance in politics, I hope you will forgive me if I tread on some somewhat delicate ground here. But I want to ask you about your former ambassador to France, your former cabinet colleague, Lucien Bouchard, with whom you used to be really great friends. And then, I guess in the way you would say it, he betrayed you over the Meech Lake Accord. Left your government, helped establish the Bloc Québécois, and the rest is history. As important as it would be to moving an agenda forward because your relationship with somebody is great, can it be equally damaging to moving files forward if you've had some, for example, heartbreaking rupture in the relationship?
Well, obviously, if the President of the United States, for example, because we're talking about him, if a foreign leader, for example, betrayed him on a deal that he thought he had with him, you would find that it would be a long time before your calls were returned, or that Canada's priorities were ever heard again. I mean, I remember when, before my time, when calls from very important people went unanswered. I remember, look, I can remember in 24 Sussex, when David Longy was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and his government banned American ships from New Zealand waters because of the nuclear component.
Yes.
And so they banned him. And he sat in my living room and asked me to talk to George Bush so he could see him. And I did. I called Bush, President Bush, and he said no, but that he would arrange for Brent Scowcroft to have a coffee with him and thing. But no, look, the Americans play hardball. They don't fool around. If you try and put the dagger into them and see what'll happen to you. And so all of this nonsense in Canada about, boy, well, we had a prime minister go down there and really kick sand in their face and really kick them in the shins. Forget it. It's all a myth.
Which one's that a reference to?
I have no idea. But it's not, I'll tell you, it's not a posture I would recommend.
Understood. A few days ago, you turned 72 years old.
That's right.
So happy
Why
birthday.
do you have to mention that?
Well, happy birthday, first of all, because that's a big deal.
Yeah.
I can remember having talked to you in the past where you've said it's a good day. Every day you wake up, you reach out to your right, you reach out to your left. If you don't feel a pine box, you're in good shape.
You're having a great day.
You're having a good day. Except that you recently discovered, and you've gone public with this, so I'm not asking you anything terribly private here, that you're a diabetic now.
That's right.
How has that changed your life?
Well, it dominates your life in the sense that, you know, you have to deal with the requirements of insulin, and I have to inject insulin, you know, 4 times a day.
In the stomach?
In the stomach. Morning, noon, night, before dinner, and then before I go to bed. And it's so your life, you're handcuffed by that new reality. That, I mean, I just can't pick up and go without all of my equipment here, like going through the airports. I mean, somebody take a look at that. The guy think I was a drug dealer, you know, with all this stuff I've got in there. But look, insulin, thank God for Banting and Best, the great Canadian discovery. I can live a full life and a good life, provided I'm reasonable and I follow the rules, which I do. I tell you, the thing that it has brought home to me, as you mentioned, I'm 72. I came down with this when I was 71. So I'm on the back 9 in this. So I was lucky. This didn't hit me until then. But I have great, enormous sympathy for young children, 4 or 5, who come down with juvenile diabetes and have to do this, what I'm doing, and their parents who have to live with this. But I've met a number of them. They're also courageous and good-humored. And it's not life-threatening unless you decline to accept the expertise. So I've got great doctors in Canada here, and I do my stuff every day, and I'm doing fine. I feel great, and I feel better than I did. So it is what it is, and I consider myself fortunate that I got this far without it.
You've had a few health scares, though, along the way.
Yeah.
And how much do you think about your mortality as a result of all that?
Well, I almost bought the farm.
I know it.
About 5 years ago here in Montreal, when they thought I wouldn't survive the weekend. You know, at that time, it was Mila and the children and that were of such concern to me, still are. But when you come that close and you manage to dodge the bullet, you know, you appreciate a little more everything that's been given to you. And so I try and, I exercise every day. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I'm boring as hell. You know, and I try and.
You used to be a lot more fun.
Oh, you're darn right. Yeah, years and years ago, darn tootin'.
Yeah.
So you know, it is what it is.
How old was your father when he died?
He was 61.
So you got well past him.
I did.
When you got to 61, did you think to yourself, my dad only got to here?
I really did. Yeah, he was a great man, electrician in a paper mill. Had 2 jobs to raise his family, and never had a nickel.
How much do you regret that he didn't get to see you become PM?
Enormously. My mom did, and thank God for that. She was with us all the way through. But I have great regrets about that when I was able to do things for him or to show him things and so on, that he had gone. But I think he knows. I think he keeps an eye on things. Yeah.
Get comfortable, because this next question is going to take a bit of setup. I know it is fashionable in some circles to say that you are the most unpopular prime minister of all time, and who knows, you may very well have been, but I think in some places you like to wear that as a bit of a badge of honor, because that means you did big things. 5 years ago, you were designated Canada's greenest prime minister ever by Corporate Knights magazine. Even Elizabeth May agreed. A decade ago, 2 professors in this city, McGill, released a study saying he had the best economic record of any prime minister in the last half of the 20th century. Free trade, GST, helping to end apartheid, leading the way on sanctions on South Africa. I could go on. Mr. Mulroney, if I may put it this way, you were making a bit of a comeback in the public's esteem. But then came the Karl-Heinz Schreiber business.
I'm not going to get into that. That's done and that's over. He's in jail in Germany, and it's a matter that's been resolved, and I have no intention of getting into it in any way. But thank you for asking.
No, I hear you, and I'm not going to replicate the elephant inquiry here. But
look, Mr. Chrétien came through a real scandal. You know, $60 million were stolen from the public treasury. 7 or 8 members of the party here went to jail in Montreal.
The sponsorship, you mean?
Sponsorship scandal. Sir John A. Macdonald had the CPR scandal. You run into all kinds. Mr. Chrétien was no more guilty than Sir John A. was, or you run into all kinds of people in politics, and this stuff happens. So you've got to just move on. It'll be in history what the CPR scandal is to Sir John A. Macdonald. Very little.
A footnote.
A footnote.
Does it bug you that some people will choose to recall that rather than your list of many accomplishments?
Not a bit. It's the way life is. It's just the way life is. There are some people who view life negatively and who are happy to remind people of any failings that they may have. As you said, I was 72. I can remember saying that, at that time I'm 70, and I've lived a full life, and I've known a lot of people. And I don't think I know a single person who's 70 or over who can say at the end of his life that his life was perfect, that he never made a mistake, that he never made an error of judgment, that everything was perfect. I don't know anybody like that. So this is what happens in life.
I'm going to press you one more time, and you can tell me to get lost if you want, but I'll try one more. You kind of painted a big target on your back for your enemies, though. I mean, you've been getting the upper hand on your critics for so many years.
Don't you worry about my enemies. They're few and far between, and history will deal with all of that. Don't you worry about that, Steve. You got other things to worry about.
Okay, moving on. I guess despite your protestations that you don't follow this stuff that carefully anymore, I'm going to finish up on, we're in a silly season here, right? We're about to go to the polls in this country. There's a tradition that former leaders don't get too involved in stuff, but they've got opinions. What are you thinking?
Well, it's what I don't have an opinion on any policy because I don't know what the campaign is going to be.
You're voting for Mr. Harper, I presume.
At this point, I'll vote for the Conservative candidate in my constituency. But look, as I told you, I think Canada is fortunate in the sense that you have 4 good people leading the major political parties, which means that at the end of the day, whatever happens, they'll either come together or a prime minister will act alone, but they'll come together, and I think they'll do some big things
Do you think
for
there's,
Canada.
excuse me, do you think there's anything illegal, illicit, or illegitimate about a Liberal NDP coalition with the Bloc's support, if that's the way it comes back?
Look, my expectation is that all of the leaders will tell you that they're going to form a government themselves, which is what they should say. And they should not speculate in any way about coalitions or all of this nonsense. They should be out there trying to win, remembering that polls do not count. The voters count. You mentioned something about reporters saying about my unpopularity and so on. Listen, I won the largest victory in the history of Canada. I won my next one in similar fashion. I was never defeated. I was the first political leader to win back-to-back majorities of any political party in 35 years, and I was the first Conservative to do it in 100 years.
Johnny MacDonald.
I was only one of 3 leaders who won 50% of the seats and more than 50% of the popular vote. And I could go on. But so what? What does this mean? It doesn't mean anything.
Well, it means you know a thing or two about politics.
Yeah, it does.
So you want to give some advice to these guys?
But unless you use that, popularity is meaningless. Unless you use it to do big and good things for your country and for the people of Canada, then it's meaningless. Who cares? Listen, I'll give you an illustration. When Harry Truman left the presidency in January of 1953, he and his wife Bess went outside and they got in their car and they drove down to Independence, Missouri, back to his hometown. And when he got there, he was greeted by a headline and you talk about a guy involved in scandals and you name it. By the time he got back, there was a headline in the Kansas City Star said, Gallup says Truman most unpopular leader in the history of polling.
And he was.
And he was. Mm-hmm. And 45 years later, in a major study by all American leading scholars of the presidency, it was determined that Harry Truman was the 5th greatest president in the history of the Republic. And what does that tell you? It tells me 2 things. First, this nonsense about popularity is meaningless. And secondly, major achievements will always rid history of the trivia and trash, and you will see leaders in their true complexion in the fullness of time.
But I'm inferring that you're bringing this up because you think you got a raw deal while you were there.
No, I brought it up because you brought it up.
Oh, okay.
That's why I didn't bring it up at all.
But you
I'm
believe...
just responding to what,
okay, no, that's fair.
What you brought.
That's fair enough. But
I don't think I got a raw deal. I won all my elections. What can I complain about?
Well, you didn't get the best press, let's put it that way.
But you know, I'm trying to make the point. I'm trying to tell you, who cares about the press?
But is it your sense that history, over the course of time, we'll start to see you in a much better light than perhaps the media of the day did?
I mean, look, the media of the day, they're entitled to their opinion. I read the other day, and I quoted it. There was a quote about Sir John A. Macdonald's, the unveiling of his portrait. And the Globe and Mail said that day, the day after Sir John unveiled his portrait, "This is the most corrupt rascal that ever dominated politics in Canada. He's a man of no achievement, no principle, no honor, and he should be dismissed immediately." Sir John A. Macdonald, the founder of our country, who built Canada with his own hands and shaped our destiny, a great man. That was the opinion of the media about the greatest leader we've ever produced. Why should I care about what some guy thinks? History will decide that.
Mr. Mulroney, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much for sitting down with us.
Thank you.
Next week on the agenda.
You might think eating a scorpion is dangerous. You would be right about that. It's really hard for meerkats to learn how to eat a scorpion. And so they have teachers who deconstruct the task for them.
That's next week on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.